Hello, chess buddies. Welcome to Amateur Chess University. Today, we'll be looking into the analysis of the round 6 game between Hikaru Nakamura and Andrey Esipenko in the Fide Chess Grand Prix Group C. This game was a top-seater affair, and you surely don't want to miss this. So, without further ado, let's head straight into the game. Esipenko here had the white pieces, and he begins with e4, going for the king's pawn opening. Hikaru replied with e5. Knight to f3 by Esipenko, going for the king's knight variation, and knight to c6 by Hikaru. Esipenko here played his light square bishop to c4, going for the Italian game, and Hikaru brought his dark square bishop to c5, going for the Giacopino game. Here Esipenko moved his pawn from d2 to d3, going for the Giacopino variation, and Hikaru developed his kingside knight to f6. The usual moves played by white in this position is pushing the c2 pawn to c3 or going for the castling. But Esipenko here moved his a2 pawn to a4. This has been played before, but not very frequently. His idea is to bring the light square bishop to b5 next. Hikaru prevents this by pushing his a7 pawn to a6. Now Esipenko goes for the kingside castling, and Hikaru pushed his d7 pawn to d6. Here Esipenko moved his a4 pawn to a5, preparing to play c3 next, and b4 after that. So Hikaru moved his dark square bishop to a safe square, bringing it back to a7. Now Esipenko moved his pawn from c2 to c3, and Hikaru castles on the king side. Here Esipenko pushed his h2 pawn to h3, blocking the g4 square from the axis of the knight and the light square bishop. And Hikaru pushed his pawn from h7 to h6, blocking the g5 square from the axis of the knight. Now Esipenko brought his dark square bishop e3, asking for the bishop exchange. Now there are several games in the database in the same position where black played the dark square bishop capturing the dark square bishop, moving the knight back to e7, or bringing the light square bishop to d7, or pushing the d6 pawn to d5. But Hikaru here moved his rook at f8 to e8, and it is as of move 10 that we have a completely new game. But this rook to e8 move allowed Esipenko to attack. He brought his queen to b3. Now the queen and the light square bishop are targeting the f7 pawn. So Hikaru here moved his queen to e7. Now Esipenko developed his knight at b1, bringing it to d2. And Hikaru moved his rook from a8 to b8. Here Esipenko played the best move in this position, capturing the bishop at a7. And the knight at c6 captured the dark square bishop at a7. And this allowed Esipenko to push his d3 pawn to d4. Hikaru didn't capture the d4 pawn. He brought his knight back to c6. And Esipenko pushed his rook from f1 to e1. Now Hikaru developed his light square bishop to d7. And Esipenko pushed his d4 pawn to d5, targeting the knight at c6. Here Hikaru moved his knight back to a7. Here Hikaru was preparing to play c6 next, followed by b5. The best idea for white in this position was to move the light square bishop to d3 and then push the c3 pawn to c4. Here Esipenko did move his light square bishop back, but to f1. Hikaru moved his knight at f6 to h7, preparing to play knight to g5 next. And Esipenko pushed his c3 pawn to c4, creating a triangular pawn chain. Now Hikaru played his knight to g5, asking for the knight exchange, which will allow the black queen to develop along this diagonal. Esipenko declined this. He brought his queen to e3. This is such a good move because now the knight at g5 is targeted by both the queen as well as the knight at f3. The knight is preparing to push the h3 pawn to h4 next. And at the same time, the knight at a7 is targeted by this queen. Here Hikaru had no other option but to capture the knight at f3. And Esipenko captured this knight at f3 with his knight at d2, still maintaining the pressure on this knight at a7. So here Hikaru was forced to move his knight back to c8, and here Esipenko pushed his b2 pawn to b4, preparing to play b5 next. Hikaru has to break this pawn chain somehow, so he pushed his pawn from f7 to f5, and Esipenko brought his light square bishop to d3. Here Hikaru moved his queen to f6, preparing to push his pawn to f4 next, targeting the queen at e3. And Esipenko cannot let this happen, so he captured the pawn at f5 with his pawn at e4, and the light square bishop captured the pawn at f5. Now both players goes for the light square bishop exchange, Esipenko captured the light square bishop at f5, and Hikaru captured the light square bishop at f5 with his queen. Esipenko moved his knight to d4, targeting the queen at f5, and the e4 pawn will not be able to capture this knight because the rook at e8 will be hanging, and this forced Hikaru to move his queen back to f7. Here, Esipenko moved his pawn from f2 to f4. Again, Hikaru cannot capture this pawn at f4 with his pawn at e5 because doing so will be a disaster. As you see here, if the pawn captures on f4, then queen captures the rook on e8, queen captures the queen on e8, and rook captures the queen on e8, and it will be white which will be comfortably pushing to victory. So after pawn to f4 by Esipenko, Hikaru pushed his pawn from c7 to c6. Now this d5 pawn is targeted twice. Now Esipenko has two options. He can either capture the pawn at c6 or the pawn at e5. A slightly better option would be to capture this pawn at c6 because this pawn at e5 is still pinned. But Esipenko captured the pawn at f5. And now Hikaru captured the pawn at d5 with his pawn at c6, targeting the c4 pawn. But Esipenko pushed his pawn from e5 to e6. Now the e6 pawn is targeting the queen at f7, and it has two defenders in the form of queen and the rook in the e file. So Hikaru moved his queen to g6. Here Esipenko moved his rook to f1, looking to bring it to f7. Here Hikaru brought his knight to e7, blocking the e6 pawn from progressing further, while also looking to bring the knight to d5. If the c4 pawn captures the pawn on d5, what Esipenko should have done in this position would have been to capture this pawn at d5 or brought his rook from a1 to c1 because a pass pawn is always dangerous. However, he decided to move his rook to f7, and this allowed Hikaru to capture the pawn at c4. Here Esipenko moved his rook from a1 to f1. Now both the white rooks are on the f file. Now the best idea for Hikaru in this position, according to the engine, is to play his queen to g5, asking for the queen exchange. And if white declines the queen exchange, moving the queen to f3, then Hikaru can move his queen to e5, now targeting the knight at d4. However, Hikaru here preferred to move his king to a safe square, bringing it to h8. Now Esipenko moved his rook to f3, looking to bring his rook to g3 and target the queen at g6. Here Hikaru moved his knight to c6, looking to go for the knight exchange and trying to eliminate one of the defendants of this e6 pawn. So Esipenko had to capture this knight at c6, and the b7 pawn captures the knight at c6. Now the pawn at b4 is hanging, but Esipenko pushed the all-important e6 pawn to e7. Now the situation is extremely complicated for black. While the rook from e8 to g8 was an available option, Hikaru wanted to prevent the checks, so he moved his king to h7. Now Esipenko moved his queen to f4, and now Hikaru moved his rook from e8 to g8. Here Esipenko moved his rook to g3, targeting this queen at g6, and Hikaru moved his queen to e6. Now Esipenko moved his rook to e3, again targeting the queen, and Hikaru moved his queen back to g6. Now the very best idea for white here is to capture this pawn at c4, because doing so will allow the white queen to continue defending this rook at f7. And if black pushes the pawn from d6 to d5, then white can bring the queen back to f4. And if black plays queen to g5, then white can play queen to d4. And if black plays rook to e8, then white can play rook to e6, launching a lot of pressure on the c6 as well as the a6 pawn. However, Esipenko didn't go for this option. He played his rook to f8. Now black obviously cannot capture it. Hikaru has to play very precisely here. So he moved his rook from b8 to e8. Now rook captures the rook on g8. The rook at e8 cannot capture the rook at g8 because it will allow white to push the pass pawn from e7 to e8. So Hikaru here captured the rook at g8 with his king. Esipenko captured the pawn at c4 with his queen, delivering a check while also targeting this pawn at c6 and a6, picking one of them surely. Here Hikaru could have pushed his pawn from d6 to d5, but he preferred to play his queen to f7, keeping his major pieces close to the e7 pawn. Here Esipenko captured the pawn at a6 with his queen, now targeting the c6 pawn. And finally, Hikaru was able to eliminate his pass pawn at e7, capturing it with his rook. Esipenko didn't capture the c6 pawn immediately. He first captured the rook at e7 and queen captured the rook at e7. And now Esipenko captured the pawn at c6. And here Hikaru played his queen to e1, delivering a check, while also surely picking up the b4 pawn. Now Esipenko had to move his king to h2, and Hikaru captured the pawn at b4, targeting the pawn at e5, while also defending the d6 pawn. Here Esipenko played queen to d5, delivering a check, and Hikaru moved his king to h8. Now the white pawn at a5 is only 3 steps away. So Esipenko should have continued with the pawn push, playing his pawn to a6. However, he moved his queen to a2. Here Hikaru played his queen to f4, delivering a check, and Esipenko moved his pawn from g2 to g3, now targeting the queen. Here Hikaru moved his queen to d4, and here Esipenko pushed his pawn from a5 to a6. Now Hikaru cannot allow this a6 pawn to move to a7 next. So he played his queen to a7. Here Esipenko moved his pawn from h3 to h4, and Hikaru pushed his pass pawn to d5. The game finally hinges on these two pass pawns at a6 and d5. Here Esipenko moved his queen to e2, and Hikaru moved his queen to d4. And Esipenko here again moved his queen back to a2, and Hikaru played his queen back to a7. Now Esipenko realized he has to bring his king into picture, so he pushed his king from h2 to g2. Then Hikaru pushed his pawn from d5 to d4. Now Esipenko played his queen to e2, and Hikaru played his queen from a7 to d7. Now Esipenko has to play a precise move to continue the game in his favor. However, he missed it. So feel free to pause the video and figure out the move Esipenko should have played in this position. If you are able to figure it out, well done. The move Esipenko should have played in this position was bringing his queen to d3, stopping this d4 pawn from progressing further. However, Esipenko here played his queen to e4, and this allowed Hikaru to push his pawn from d4 to d3. And now both the pass pawns at a6 and d3 are only 2 steps away from obtaining the queen. Now Esipenko tried one last roll in the dice. He moved his queen to b7, and Hikaru, for obvious reasons, cannot go for the queen exchange. He moved his queen to d8. Here Esipenko moved his pawn to a7, and Hikaru pushed his pawn to d2. Now Esipenko pushed his pawn from a7 to a8, obtaining a new queen, and Hikaru pushed his pawn from d2 to d1, obtaining a queen. Now Esipenko captured the queen on d8 with his queen, and it was in this position on move 58 that both players agreed to a draw. Now Hikaru will obviously capture the queen at d8 next, and we will have a very identical position for both white and the black, with the king and two pass pawns in the same end, and this is just a dead draw. So that's the game. Hikaru was under tremendous pressure due to continuous attack from the white pieces, but he was able to dug deep to come out of this losing situation. Esipenko could have played some more aggressive moves as he was having the advantage, but he wasn't able to, and the game ended in a draw. If you have any thoughts on the game, feel free to share below. Thank you for watching. Take care. See you.